Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program George Swartz, who is VP of Shipper Solution Sales at Loadsmart. And today we're going to talk about how managed transportation services enable resilient supply chains. So here we are already in the second quarter of 2024. And I think it's fair to say that we continue to live in interesting times, especially if you're a transportation professional. We might still be in a quote unquote shippers market, but as we've learned, so many times before, the pendulum can quickly swing in the other direction, without any warning. So, which is why creating resilient supply chains, remains so important, especially from a transportation perspective. So what does creating a resilient supply chain mean, particularly from a from a transportation perspective? And how does managed transportation services help enable it? Well, those are the two key questions that we're going to explore in today's conversation. And it's great to have George on the program to share his insights and advice on this topic. So, George, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Adrian. Appreciate it. Glad to be here.
Great. Well, like I just said in my opening comments, the term resiliency kind of reemerged, during the whole COVID, pandemic, as many companies, were struggling with, all aspects of their supply chains with all the disruptions that were going on. But even today, I think you can argue that being resilient or creating resilient supply chains, remains important. So we continue to hear a lot about that in conversations and blog posts and conferences and everything else. But what does that mean exactly? I mean, from your perspective, when you're having conversations with clients and things like that, and from your perspective, I mean, what does it mean exactly, and why is it important?
It's interesting because it's got a few connotations when you talk about a resilient supply chain. One of the things that comes to mind for me typically is flexibility. Things are changing, and I mean, you look at the events of the last couple of weeks, and the Port of Baltimore, disaster, and that created changes that nobody thought about. And are they immediate? Yes. Are they long term? Not necessarily, but they create disruption. So a resilient supply chain is one that can sometimes anticipate, but at least be ready for unplanned disruptions. But from a flexibility standpoint, it's also looking at sources of supply changing, looking at distribution networks, shifting, becoming more agile. It's looking at the result of mergers and acquisitions, changes in your market. There's so many things that can affect what a distribution network looks like, and then that in turn affects what transportation looks like to be able to serve that. In addition, we've seen, it was amplified during COVID, but we've seen patterns around consumer demands shifting. Last mile deliveries become so much more of an emphasis than it used to be, and again amplified, kind of ridiculously during COVID. But the idea that I want stuff now, and an interesting thing that I'm seeing resilient supply chains need to react to is the fact that when you look at the people that are moving into decision-making positions, as the baby boomers and Gen Xers are aging out of their positions, and retiring or moving up in the organizations, that sort of thing. Millennials are moving into those positions. They grew up in this instant gratification kind of scenario where I could order it from Amazon and have it on my doorstep tomorrow morning. Well, you come into the workplace with a similar expectation. And we're seeing that impact on transportation, which means that I've got to get closer to market. Shorter hauls make sense. I've got to have inventory positioned, and I've got to have these very, very flexible last mile delivery networks. Another element of resiliency, I think, that comes into play is some companies will use that and talk about sustainability. And we're trying to be more green. We're trying to be more responsible with the supply chain. So as I'm looking at these changes, I'm looking at, what can I do differently with transportation that lets me take miles out of the total equation? We work with clients to optimize LTL into truckload, for example, and that's taking tens of thousands of miles a year off the table that reduces carbon footprint. It's greener. It's a better way to look at things. And then we're going to have to look at what impact technology is going to have around the whole transportation landscape, as we move forward. So resiliency, to kind of summarize my thoughts here, and I know I'm scattered, but it's got a lot of connotations to it. It's got, the flexibility aspect. It's got the ability to quickly react to things that are going on around you, and it's got the green or sustainable aspects that go along with it. So there's a lot of pieces to it. It's kind of a complex topic, but at the end of the day, it's it's the opposite of the old static supply chain where you would do a distribution network strategy, you decide how many distribution centers you needed, you built them, and then you lived with that for 20 years. That's just not happening anymore. If it is, you're a dinosaur and you're going to get left behind by your competition.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up a lot of great points, and I think I see similar types of things as well. I mean, I think the reality is that you talked about static and dynamic. I mean, the supply chains have never really truly been static because plans, things never go according to plan. There's always
Right.
been change and disruptions. But I think the frequency of the change is happening much more quickly than in the past. And I think you've got, obviously, we're not living in 1980 anymore. We're not living in even the year 2000 anymore. The consumer base, as you brought up, and not only the consumer base, but also the employee base is different today than
Yep.
it was. So all these factors, I think, as discussed, are coming into play to the reality that things that we thought might everyone goes through their budgets and their plans end of year in terms of what's going to happen in the year ahead. But now I think everybody recognizes that more likely than not, that's not going to be what's going to transpire over the next few months. That there's going to be things that are going to be unexpected that are going to happen. And when that happens, you've got to be able to be flexible, quickly respond to them, and do so faster and more effectively than the competition, because that's going to enable you to at least stay on track as best as possible to your higher level objectives in terms of financial service objectives and so forth. But if you've got inflexible systems, inflexible processes, and you've got a mindset that's still stuck in the 80s, let's say, or you're not going to be able to succeed moving forward here.
Yep. And I think a great example here recently, again, we talked about, very recent with Port of Baltimore, and they're already, working through the plans to get the ship channel open so that, at least that portion of the impact will be lessened. I look at, the issues we've been having with the Panama Canal and, the resilient carriers and providers enacted land bridges immediately to rail product across and transload it so they didn't have to stop the flow of goods. So it may not be the perfect solution, but it allowed them to keep going. And, that demonstrates creativity and resiliency in that supply chain. We see it every time there's a major natural disaster. We see it, with different things that happen around the world. World world politics are having a major impact on the supply chain right now too, with the issues with the Red Sea and the Suez. And we're going to continue to have disruptions, while we're in kind of this volatile political environment too. And we just have to keep looking for creative ways to solve that. The other thing I think that companies that are embracing supply chain resiliency are doing is they're doing a bit of what if planning. They're doing, call it disaster preparedness at this point, but they're coming up with, thinking through, what if this happens? What if that happens? What's my reaction to it? So that I'm not caught flat-footed every time there's a situation that disrupts the supply chain. And by doing that, I at least have thought through, have made some kind of contingency planning about how I'm going to react to it.
Yeah, I mean that last point, it reminds me of the saying, right? Failure to prepare is preparing to fail, right?
Yep,
So,
absolutely.
and I think that's that's a motto that I think everyone in supply chain logistics and particularly in transportation management can take to heart. So, you already touched a little bit about this, but I'm kind of curious to maybe expand on it a little bit. So, in light of everything we just talked about, I mean, how is the transportation landscape, changing or need to change, again,
Yeah.
in response to all of these, challenges and risks that are out there?
We have a number of things going on because there's several factors impacting it. I mean, there's always the traditional, yeah, and we always hear there's driver shortages, and there are. I mean, if you look today, there's a couple things feeding into this. When I look at the Gen Zers, the millennials, the folks that are coming up, they're not going into that as a profession. Yeah, we're seeing a smaller influx of people that want to be truck drivers. Yeah, so we've got to figure out, we're still going to have to move goods. We're still a ways away from totally autonomous vehicles before that's a reality, and we have the infrastructure in place for that to happen. So in the interim, we're going to have to keep closing that gap because the need for drivers is becoming greater and greater. And then add to that, we're not in we're not building our military as large as we used to. And the reason I bring that up, that used to be a great source of drivers. As folks would learn that as a trade in the military, they'd come out, they'd go right into it, in civilian life. And we're not seeing near the influx of that. In fact, it's the same phenomena that airlines are going through with not having pilots. We're not training near as many military pilots as we used to, which was a great training ground for commercial pilots. And that not only affects commercial, but it also affects air freight and anything else that we need to fly. So you have that impact, where I've got less labor than I need. We've got to get creative in terms of how we're going to attract people into this. I think the advance of EV and trucking will help with this. It's a matter of how quickly it can happen because an EV based tractor trailer or cargo truck is going to be easier to train on, easier to drive, easier to operate than a traditional tractor trailer is today. So that's going to help. I saw a great example. I actually saw it from a friend of mine from Europe who was talking about his son, who's a big gamer, was playing a tractor trailer based, cargo delivery based game now online and playing with his buddies. And they're connected, just like they would be truckers with radios and talking and making deliveries, and their metrics are around on time delivery and that sort of thing. It intrigued me, kind of the same way that we're getting folks attracted to being pilots through video games and through gaming. There could be a path there to attract people into truck driving. Hard to say. The other thing we're seeing is the desire to have shorter length of hauls, by the folks out there. And that's actually it spurs a couple of things. I think it helps drive intermodal, because that takes the driver out of the equation for a big chunk of the transit especially when you're talking about North America. We're seeing a lot more folks moving into the gig economy and last mile delivery. Whether it's working part-time, driving an Amazon van, or driving an Uber Eats type thing or an Uber Freight. Various different gig economy delivery methods for last mile delivery that are attracting someone who's not necessarily looking for 40 hours and looking to be over the road and those kind of things. So you got some things going on there. And then I think we're seeing a lot more micro fulfillment being set up, which is putting goods closer to the market, a lot more short haul for final delivery and for cargo delivery into customers, into retailers, into those sort of things. So you got a bunch of those things that are changing the transportation landscape. And then I think you're gonna continue to see companies pushing towards regional operations, pushing more to intermodal and to rail instead of over the road coast to coast tractor trailer. So those are some of the things that I see that kind of are shaping and changing the transportation landscape out there.
Yeah, no, again, a lot of great points there. I mean, a couple of other things that I see, I just kind of curious what you think. I mean, certainly we've seen, when I started as an industry analyst, 25 years ago, virtually no one outside of, very niche areas were doing parcel, right?
Yeah.
And parcel was like, minuscule part of their transportation budget. But now obviously for retailers, it's a big part of, because of the e-commerce boom, and even manufacturers are, parcel is becoming, part of their, transportation spend, a growing part of their transportation spend. So I think that's one area that I've seen. And the other one that I've seen is also just in the procurement, kind of the mindset that a lot of companies have with procurement, like we were talking about earlier. It used to be, you would set up your procurement contract, procurement engagement, you had your contracts, and then, you wouldn't think about it or look at it for the balance of the year until the next procurement cycle. But now, we're kind of seeing kind of companies looking at spot and contract in a more fluid, so more mini bids, more, kind of revisiting certain areas or geographies or problem lanes on a more frequent basis. So again, another example of that resiliency, dynamic nature, even, affecting the procurement side of things. Are you seeing that as well?
Absolutely. I mean, you think you were talking about, let's go back to, 2000, even 2010. Your basic company did an annual bid, and they would, they try to squeeze their rates down 2 or 3%, lock in their core carriers, and then just sit there. Today, you see a lot more companies doing quarterlies. You see even more companies, to your point, doing spot. It has helped the brokerage market to explode in terms of the number of companies out there. I mean, Loadsmart, if you look at our origins 8 years ago, we were a brokerage. That's how we came to be, and then we added the rest of our services around that. But it was as that market was starting to explode and grow. So yeah, and I think what you're seeing with it is a need for tools to help manage that spot market, and people with expertise to help manage that procurement, because it's not quite the same thing doing an annual carrier bid as it is doing mini bids and spot quotes and spot buys, day in and day out. So it takes more expertise. And then you couple that with the fact, and we talked about it on the truck driver side, but on the operations side, if you look at people going into logistics and supply chain, it's not a big field for Gen Zers and millennials to go into, not in the numbers that, Gen Xers and boomers went into it. So we've got a bit of a talent drain there too, which opens the door for organizations like Loadsmart and others that can help manage that, manage everything from the procurement cycle with all the complexities we talked about, all the way through execution.
So that brings me, that last point brings me to my next question. I mean, historically, when it came to, managing the transportation operations, I mean, companies really had two basic options, right? Either they could invest internally, right? So invest in the people, build up, their transportation department, invest in technology, implement their own, TMS, and then manage the operations themselves, or they would just like hand over the keys to a 3PL and outsource everything, to them. I mean, are those still kind of the only two options that, shippers have out there?
Yeah, no, you're seeing hybrids, that have emerged. If you look at our managed transportation group, for example, within Loadsmart, we can do turnkey. We can take over the whole operation if that's what you want. But quite often what we're looking at is a combination of a platform that a client may have or want to acquire, and expertise that we bring to the table. We combine those into a hybrid solution, into more of a full freight management solution. Great example of that is a lot of clients will have a basic transportation management system, may help them on some of the carrier selection, on order tendering, and execution, but it doesn't have optimization capabilities. For example, the ability to take all my loads and combine them into the next least cost denominator mode. In other words, taking LTLs and making them larger shipments, or truckloads with stop offs, looking at my truckloads, figuring out when I can do intermodal. All of that load planning and optimization piece that requires some complex algorithms and an understanding of how to use them, rather than and to get a tier 1 or tier 2 solution that'll do that can cost quite a bit of money. You could be spending $500,000 to $1 million to acquire and install one of those, and it can take 6 months to a year to get up and running. We and others in our space offer the ability to get up and running in a matter of weeks. We do the optimization and load planning for you. You can still maintain the execution piece of that if that's what you want to do. And then we'll provide technology to do tracking and tracing, to manage the whole RFP piece on the front end, so that in the market you're seeing these hybrid models come up, and we continue to adapt. We've got a number of capabilities. We look at each client's situation kind of uniquely, and with a custom set of eyes to figure out, all right, what makes the most sense for what you're doing. And that way, if you want to keep your transportation group, or if your transportation group's gotten smaller and you want to add capabilities, we can work with you to do that. And it's not just us. There's a number of providers out there that have gone this direction, but it has gotten away from just the black or white. Either I go buy a TMS, spend a year screwing it in and try to figure out how to use it, or I flip it over the fence to a 3PL and tell them to do everything. We've come a long way since those were the two options.
Yeah, and I've been a big fan of the MTS model because I think, I almost equate it to cloud computing, right? So if you look at cloud computing, there are times where you might need more computing power to solve different problems or whatever. So the nice thing about cloud computing is that you don't have to invest in additional servers and additional, hardware and so forth when you need, when you have peaks and valleys of need for computing power. The problem is that, you can invest in all this additional hardware, but you won't need it for half the year, or you only need it for certain periods of time. And I think
Yep.
it's the same thing with, managed transportation services, is that, you can flex up or down depending on what your particular needs are. So going back to kind of that flexibility, I mean, maybe for some companies today, their need is technology, right? So they may have the people, but they don't have the technology, and they can tap a partner to tap that technology piece of it. But maybe in a few years, 2 or 3 years on the road, they decide to, bring the technology in house. But now they might be adding different lanes or going to a different geographic region, or they may want to allocate some of the resources they have into other areas. So now they need more of the human IP, the resources side. So they
Yep.
can work with the partner to say, hey, you know what, we're going to scale back on the technology side, but we want to scale up on tapping your market knowledge or expertise, or it might be on a procurement side. So I think that's where I think the value is from my perspective, is this hybrid approach allows you to, really, rather than say, okay, we're gonna fix the nature of a relationship for the next 3 to 5 years, and you're gonna do this and we're gonna do this, or you're gonna do this and we're gonna do none of it. It's really saying, hey, you know what? As our needs change, we're gonna work with you to help us, fill in the gaps where there might be people gaps, where there might be technology gaps, where there might be geographic gaps, whatever the case might be. And I think that's the nice thing that I see. I think why a lot of shippers kind of gravitate towards that model, because it is, it provides that flexibility to, address their changing needs,
Yep.
over time. So
Well,
go
it
ahead.
lets them take advantage of leverage as well, because if you think of a used optimization as a example, typically the client will get, X number of orders coming down a day. They're looking at a bunch of LTLs that they want to figure out how best to handle. Using an optimization tool might take a couple hours a day, to do their planning and figure out their loads, etc. But they've got a resource that they've trained on that, and that's their job. Where we would run it through a center of excellence where we're getting the orders in, we're leveraging a team across multiple clients for the optimization piece, and we can get much better economies of scale, with doing that, and the client gets the full benefit of the expertise that we have, not having to buy the technology to be able to do it, etc.
Yeah, that's a good example. So, I mean, what attributes or capabilities should companies look for in a managed transportation service provider, particularly if they're looking to create a more resilient supply chain?
Yep. It to some degree it depends on what they're looking for and what their current capabilities are. One of the things that we worked with a client on in the beginning is, let's understand what you want to be, what you want your core competency inside your organization to be, and then let's talk about how we add to that. We have some manufacturing clients, for example, that don't want to be in the transportation management business. They're happy to ask us to do the majority of the transportation management planning. We have others that have an established transportation group, but they're not capable of doing the optimization like I talked about, or they're not, sourcing and procurement is not their thing. So we figure out what to bring to the table. Then what you want to do when you're searching for an MTS provider is you want to make sure they have capabilities across the gamut of what you would like to do. I mean, we can, as I said, we can do end to end, or we can do any piece of that. But if the client's vetting us and checking the box on sourcing and, carrier sourcing and procurement, yes. Load planning, optimization, route planning, yes. Then we're looking at full execution if they want that. Yes, we can do that. Tracking, tracing, shipment visibility, which is a big one. And then if they want to go all the way through freight audit and payment, we have capabilities there. So I would suggest you that if you're a shipper and you're trying to figure out what MTS folks should I be talking about, or what service providers should I be talking to? Get your checklist together of the things that you're going to need. Make sure that they're capable of all of those, and then test that with them. Do they have case studies? Do they have demos that they can do for me? What kind of platform do they have behind it? All of those kind of questions.
Yeah, and I think kind of an important point that you kind of alluded to there. I mean, one of it is you may have your immediate need today. I mean, let's just say it's procurement, or it might be a technology side of things. It might be a TMS. But like I was referring to before, your needs might change in a year's time or 2 years' time, and so you want to make sure that the partner you've selected might be able to assist you in other ways in the future. So that might not be your top priority thing or your need right now, but it might be your need in the future. And rather than have to go and establish a whole new relationship with somebody else, is this a partner you can grow with, or that they're able to adjust and meet your needs as your needs change? So really having that breadth and of capabilities, and then like you said, being able to validate them, if you will, or through speaking with other customers and so forth. And I think technology is such a critical part of this. I mean, I would imagine that in virtually every client engagement that you have, there is some technology component to it as well.
Oh, absolutely. It comes down to we have a platform that we use on the carrier sourcing and spot quote, RFP management, bid management. It's called Shipper Guide, and we'll bring that to the table. If a client, and we can kind of extend into other technology areas, we have a dock scheduling and dock management software offering as well. We do a gate management piece. All these can be pieced together depending on what the client is looking for. And then of course we've got a tier one optimization engine that we rely on and use. So there's definitely technology elements that go there. We've built, all the standard APIs that you need to plug in. And then of course, there's always still some custom integration. That's another question you want to ask. Is your MTS provider capable of doing the integration things that you need to get done? Because typically if you are buying a TMS off the shelf, now you're hiring an integrator to go along with it to do, some of the integration stuff. So you want to make sure if you're looking at an MTS provider, do they bring those capabilities to the table as well?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, the integration piece, time and time again, that's always been the Achilles heel of many, both TMS implementation as well as MTS or 3PL client relationships. Have gone awry because of poor integration. Which brings me to the last question. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground. We could probably end up talking for another hour on all these things, but maybe as a way to wrap up. I mean, what defines or enables a successful business relationship between an MTS provider and a client? In other words, I mean, how can the two parties create, a long-term win-win, partnership?
Yep. And it goes back to something I learned a while back in my career. One of the basics is if you're the client, if you're a shipper thinking about going this route, don't think that you can just flip the problem over the fence. It's a hands-off kind of situation. At the end of the day, as a shipper, you still own that relationship with your customer. Now, your MTS provider or your transportation management provider is going to be a key component of that. And for that reason, you want to partner. You want this to be a partnership. We're in this together. We're sharing metrics. We're communicating, regularly, both formally and informally. We're doing business reviews to understand that we're meeting the needs that you have, that you're meeting the monetization side of the business that we need to continue to be able to do it. We're sharing KPIs and metrics. One of the things I love to see in these kind of programs is the willingness to do a gain share program, so that we're going to identify savings. That's one of the reasons you do this, is you're trying to control costs, bring down costs, those kinds of things. A great relationship can be built if you establish baselines across the areas where you're going to save, and be willing to incent your provider by doing a gain share program. And it may be nominal. You may share 10% of the savings with the provider, but it keeps continuous improvement going. It keeps motivation where you want it to be, and everybody's got some skin in the game. But it really, the one word that really defines success for this is it's a partnership.
That's a great point, and I've said the same thing to many companies as well. You may be outsourcing all or just parts of your operations, but you're not outsourcing responsibility. You're ultimately responsible at the end of the day to your end client, in terms of cost and service requirements and so forth. So you need to be involved as well, right? And it truly needs to be, a partnership. Well, George, I think again, like I said, we've covered a lot of ground here. You've provided some great insights in terms of what's happening in the transportation market right now, and how managed transportation services fits into all of this. So I want to thank you for making the time to be with us today.
Adrian, I appreciate the opportunity. It was great speaking with you. Again, like you, I could talk about this for hours, but I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. So thank you.
Great. I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the Loadsmart website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for George, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.